Here's the outline of what I'd like to talk about. When Itani asked me to come and talk at a Conscious Cities conference, Conscious Cities, what is that? I better think about consciousness in cities and figure out how that connects with the work that I do. So I'll talk, so I didn't actually have a great deal of success thinking about that, but I'll talk a little bit about how I see consciousness in cities related to the kinds of work that I do. And then I want to spend most of my time talking about this idea of developing what I've called emotional topographies in cities, which reflects most directly to the work that I've done in my research. And then end with something that's really quite a bit more speculative, that deals with some work that's really at this point not even in motion very much, but it is beginning with some ideas. So first of all, in terms of consciousness in cities, I have no idea what it might mean for a city to actually be conscious, but one of the things that really interests me is the manner in which the marks of use in cities might reflect the perceptions and memories of the people who use those cities. And so I want to begin with something that you can see here, which is really simple and obvious that everybody knows about, which is the desire line. And as you can see from the slide, you can think of desire lines in a number of different ways. Sometimes I think of them as sort of like a conflict between the intentions of the designers of a site and the desires of the people who use that site. So it's sort of a crowdsourced design charrette in a way that sometimes highlights failures, as one might see what you can see in the slide. So that's really obvious. Desire lines are obvious, but I think that if you kind of spin out this idea of desire in cities and lines of desire in cities, then there's some really interesting subtleties. And one that occurred to me is this one, which it might not look like it from this slide. I'm not sure how well you can see this actually, but this is a highly personal set of desire lines for me. The desire lines that have meaning for me in this slide, you can't actually see. And they came from a visit that I took. This is actually a photograph taken in London, in an area where I lived when I was a little boy. I lived here over 50 years ago for a few years. And I went back to visit some of my old haunts, and I walked up to the fence that you can see on the left side of this slide. And I had this insurmountable desire to run up to the fence and run my hands along the tines of the fence, reflecting, I think, things that I might have done when I lived in that area over 50 years ago. So you can see, again, they're very hard to see, and I didn't notice this until I dug up this slide, but you can see some physical desire lines, I think, running along the fence that might, in fact, reflect the fact that I was not the only person to ever have this desire to run my hands along the fence tines. But for me, what's interesting about this is that there are desire lines here that cannot be seen. They're invisible. They're maybe not just mine, but they're not physical markings in the environment. So that's a little bit of a segue into thinking about how emotion and lived experience can be reflected in the marks of the city, both visible and invisible. And now I'll turn to a little bit of the kind of work that I do that, in some cases, I think maybe makes those desire lines or contours visible. I do a lot of research in field settings. I take people out for walks on the streets, lead them to different locations, measure them in a number of different ways. So here are just a couple of images giving you the idea of what a psychology on the street experiment might look like. Here's an example taken. You can see obviously there's a group of people here. It's pretty low tech. They're being invited to look at things. They're being asked to answer questions about those things, and you can't see much else going on in this picture. But there actually is a little bit of physiology as well that I'll get to in a second. So again, they're led from site to site. This was an experiment in New York City. This was actually the first one of these walking experiments that we did. Here's another example. This is staged. These are all students who work in my lab. But you can see now there's a little bit more gear involved. There's some eye tracking. They're wearing these funky headbands that measure brain waves, and I'll talk more about those in a second. We commonly use devices that measure skin conductance. So skin conductance is a rough and ready measure of physiological arousal of all kinds, both good and bad. It's essentially a measurement of the underlying state of your sweat glands. And there are lots of different kinds of devices from consumer grade upwards that can be used to measure skin conductance unobtrusively and easily. and a variety of such devices are shown here. So one of the ways in which you can use these kinds of devices is to, in these walking experiments, to try to highlight the effect of different kinds of variables in the urban surround on people's feelings and on their behavior. And one of the things that's interested us quite intensively over the years has been the effect of the complexity of building facades, so the skins of buildings, what's on them, how they vary, even sometimes boiling down to the mathematical properties that can be measured that indicate facade complexity. And so what you're looking at here is a couple of examples of what we would call high complexity facades, one in New York, one in Berlin, and here's a couple of examples of low complexity facades. The left again is New York, the right is Berlin. That's a restaurant, believe it or not. And you can, without going into the details, you can intuit easily the differences between those two different kinds of facades. So one of the things that interests us is how those different facade styles might influence your physiology, your psychology, your behavior. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of one of the things that we discovered, there seems to be a profound impact of facade complexity on skin conductance responses. So what you're looking at in this slide is those bars represent different scores, so they're differences from baseline measures taken before the experiment begins, and the left bar shows what happens when people are standing in front of those low complexity, bland, I would call them boring facades, and the right bar shows what happens when people stand in front of high complexity facades. And there's a nice robust difference that we've shown in a number of different kinds of field settings and also in the laboratory, suggesting that the kinds of surroundings that you find yourself in actually does have this quite substantial impact on what's happening in your mind.
This meeting is about to end, as the moderator will
That's it! No, I completely lost my train. Anyway, I'll just move on. So, facade complexity is one example of a variable in the urban surround that can impact psychology. Another thing that we've looked at, I mentioned earlier on, is brainwaves. We really like trying to use consumer-grade gear. There's a lot of really fancy stuff for measuring brainwaves. We really like to push the consumer-grade stuff to see what you can get out of it. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. One of the big ones being that if you can make consumer-grade gear perform in a way that can give you reasonable data, and I think these devices that I'm showing here on my Hansen where I student Adam do, then there are all kinds of interesting possibilities for crowdsourcing citizen science to really do some interesting kinds of experiments with this kind of stuff. So this is a simple headband that measures some really crude frontal EEG. You can use it on the road. For those of you who know about EEG, I'll show you some full disclosure. I call it pretty bad data and very bad data. And for the most part, pretty bad data is about the best you can get out of these devices compared to lab-grade measures of EEG. But if you have some really clever people in your labs, it turns out that somehow I do, there are ways of extracting useful information from even pretty bad data that can tell you interesting things about brainwaves in really herky-jerky field settings where the headband is moving around a little bit and there's wind and there's facial movement and there's, as much as you try to clamp down on people talking, people like to talk and that messes with your measurements. So we can extract some interesting measures from brainwaves. I'll give you a quick snippet of an example of something that we've done. I'll show you again, this was a walking experiment. These were 3 different locations that we took people to. You can see here a nice urban park setting. This is a setting with some, I would say, fairly boring and bland residential development, but some landscape architecture, so there's some nice green there. And here's one of those places in the city where you might ask, why is this here? And one of the things that we did was to measure the proportion of alpha wave activity present in people's resting EEGs just as they stood standing at these sites. And the idea being that generally one would predict that alpha wave activity would be indicative of a relaxed mental state. And so here's proportion of alpha activity as a function of the power of the entire EEG. And you can see here that it's a modest piece of data, Not all that surprising, not particularly mind-blowing, but it does again suggest that you can actually use these cheap, interesting tools to extract measures of brain physiology on the road from participants. And then just to, if I thought further, I might have put these slides in a slightly different order, but I'll show these next couple now. The idea is to kind of take those kinds of contrasts, one place to another that I described to you, and build them out to some kind of topography, some kind of map-based representation of something. So what you're looking at here is, of course, just a street view image of a part of a city. This is New York again. And you can see that blue contour. That blue contour represents the average amount of physiological arousal in a group of people walking around a prescribed route through the city of New York. And I won't go into all of the grisly details of the whys and wherefores of the ups and downs, other than to point out that, again, what you're seeing here is that there are contours, that there are places in cities that produce more physiological arousal than other places. And the one thing that I will note, if the cursor works, which seems to, is you can't quite see the very bottom of this image, but down here we had people walk into a park, and you can see physiological arousal going really low, and up here you can see a piece of low and high density facade, and you can see some differences there. Here's a similar thing. This is just a heat map of subjective responses. So I mentioned this early on. We asked people a lot of questions about how they feel, as well as testing their bodies. And this is just an example of some data from an experiment in Toronto showing how we can map out people's feeling states, their preferences, their desires, and so on, as a function of some kind of map. And this is a map of a small neighborhood in Toronto. So the interim conclusion from all of this, I would say that it actually seems as though it's possible to develop reasonably interesting emotional topographies of cities or parts of cities using, for the most part, simple consumer-grade kinds of tools. So the big question is, why? You know, what use might that be? What could we do with that information? Well, one answer that I've already sort of given along the way is this one, that we can use this kind of data to explore human-based design principles. So when I talked about the impact of high and low complexity facades, that might be a useful piece of information, especially if you spin that out to its subtleties and look at nuances beyond just simple, incredibly brutal dead facades and really lively facades. You could look at the intermediate states and you can identify, for example, maybe a sweet spot for facade complexity. Another thing that you might be able to do with this kind of data, again, if you can scale up and crowdsource this, you could use potentially the kind of human data that I've described to you as a set of inputs for smart city design. So here the idea is to move from simply measuring in a kind of static situation, we built this, how does this affect your brain, how does this affect your brain? Now looking at the possibility that maybe in a dynamic and ongoing way, with larger groups of people, we can actually measure the effects of design variables on people and potentially have those design variables be flexible after things are built. In other words, have environments that move towards some level of responsivity and interaction. The third idea, and I think maybe this is something that hasn't been thought about enough, but it may just be my own ignorance, but the third idea is the idea that maybe we could take the data, the kind of data that I'm describing to you, and turn it back to the users. So rather than have this physiological, psychological data be stuff that we can use in our cloistered labs to figure out design principles or to provide inputs to algorithms for smart city designs, what if the crowdsourced data that's being collected is turned back and somehow made visible, made real to users? So apologies for this next slide. It's a little bit of a collage. I did it myself, and I'm no graphic artist, as you can see. But the idea here is to take those invisible desire lines that I described to you at the beginning of my talk and say, what happens if you make those psychological and physiological desire lines visible to the crowd? So you can see some color overlay in this image. So imagine that you're walking down the street and you are exposed to maybe the collection of emotional responses, the crowdsourced emotional topography of the location that you're in. Imagine that this is some kind of a heat map representation, and imagine that you're getting this through something like maybe Google Glasses, but a version of Google Glasses that actually works well. What would that do? What would turning that information back to the user, what effect would that have on your relationship with an urban environment? And so this leads me to the last really speculative part of the talk, thank you, which is the next and our most recent step. We've gone into partnership with a group in Waterloo led by the architect Philip Beasley called the Living Architecture Systems Group to look at genuine interaction and co-agency, maybe using experimental models to try to figure out how it's possible to develop interaction and co-agency among users of a setting, a space, an installation, something. In this case, the LASG specializes in producing these magnificent, I guess you'd call them sculptures. They're responsive sculptures. The image that you're seeing is one such sculpture. We call them sentient veils. The idea is, and I'll show you a movie in just, in fact, why don't I turn to the movie? So here's one still. Here's another still. You get the idea that they're big. They're also responsive. I hope this movie will work. It looks like it's going to. Yay.
You're on.
So the sculptures are designed with, as you can see, these beautiful fern-like fronds. They're built with resistance wire. They have a lot of distributed microprocessing, really simple microprocessing using mostly things called Teamseas and a bit of Arduino. And as you can see from the video, these things actually respond to human interaction. They respond in really interesting ways. And so the intention with the partnership between the Urban Realities Lab and LASG is to use this as a model system for understanding, again, how to build co-agency between individuals and groups and structures of all kinds. And one of the kind of long-range aspirations for this is to take some of the high-flying experimental principles that might arise from this kind of work and see if we can apply them to any aspects of urban design. Is it possible to take what we might learn from the responsiveness, from the development of maybe something like empathic loops between structure and person, and apply that to life in the city? And I think that's a really important problem for us to solve. In fact, on the car radio on the way here, I heard the latest news story about the epidemic of loneliness in cities in the city of London, which we know is a worldwide phenomenon. We know that one of the big problems that cities need to find ways to solve, in fact, one of the, I think the root goals of urban design ought to be to find ways to use design to build social capital, to break down barriers between people, to help with this problem, first identified, well, probably not first, but identified clearly by Jane Jacobs, that cities, as she said, are by definition filled with strangers. How can that be changed? Maybe one kind of pie-in-the-sky way of changing that is to use responsive environments to build a sense of co-agency in cities, that we are all contributing to something like, for example, emotional topographies, and that we understand that connection, that we can actually influence the mindscape of a city through our own behavior, our thoughts, and our feelings. Thank you. Acknowledgement to all of the many people who've helped to do work that I pretended to do by myself just now. Thanks a lot.